Segregation. Milwaukee is one of the most segregated cities in the country. This fascinates me. I'm intrigued by this statement because of the questions it poses. It's a statistic, meaning the statement in itself isn't necessarily debatable. It is this way. And so follow-up conversation doesn't need to include arguments about whether the statement is true or false. It's a fact, not an opinion. One of the mathematical calculations used to assign a place's level of segregation is called the dissimilarity index. The dissimilarity index is a score from 0 to 100, which identifies the number of individuals from one group which would have to move to have an equal representation within a city and its surrounding suburbs. An index of 100 would mean total and complete segregation, and a score of 0 would indicate complete integration based on that area's demographic makeup. The score is based on census data and is available for metro areas across the country. Milwaukee's score in 2020 was around 80, which means 80% of the black residents would have to move to create a fully integrated metro area. The first question that comes to my mind is whether or not we think it's a good thing that Milwaukee or any other major metropolitan area is segregated. Clearly, at one time, enough people thought that it was a good idea, at least enough to organize themselves in such a way that created the segregated space Meg and I inhabit today. Enough people 80 or 100 years ago thought it was a good idea and did enough work to impact the housing habits of 1.5 million people. However, I can't recall a conversation I've had in recent years where someone talks favorably about the segregated nature of the city. It seems like something we all don't like. I'm sure there was a time in the past when segregating ourselves sounded like a good idea. I think people had what they believed to be good intentions. I also think if those people were time-traveled 80 years into the future, they would make different decisions. Race relations, specifically as it pertains to Milwaukee, has been something Meg and I have cared deeply about for a long time. It's why we chose to buy our house where we did. It's why we haven't had any substantial conversations about moving away from the neighborhood. And it's why both of us organize our lives around improving the neighborhood. Something strange happened in the summer of 2020. There was a long stretch of time where I wasn't confident articulating my life choices, not because of anything I experienced living where we do, but because so few people could understand why we would want to live there, a thing I rarely, if ever, question. After the summer of 2020, the puzzled look slowly turned into questions. Those questions have become more thoughtful in the ensuing years, maybe even more empathetic. They evolved into less about Meg and I and more about our neighbors. I believe today it would be insane for someone to write a racially restrictive covenant into the deed of their home. I'm sure someone tries to pull it off, but the average American would find that deplorable. When I think about the trajectory of race relations in our city and others, I'm encouraged by the times I stop and think about what it was like 80 years ago. I don't find comfort in thinking about the way things were, but I find some reassurance in knowing how they were and how far we've come. I feel the same way about the social justice habits of people en masse. Before George Floyd was murdered, a set of habits and beliefs existed, and today those habits and beliefs are different. It's plausible that beliefs and habits will continue to evolve, and I think the dissimilarity index is a tool we can use to understand our progression as a city. As far as the question, is it good that Milwaukee is one of the most segregated cities in the country? Again, I've never heard someone vocalize that they're in favor of keeping things the way they are, but I've heard many people vocalize their desire for change. Over the years, I've noticed people have an opinion about their role in social issues, typically pertaining to how much of a contribution they have to the issue. If someone cares about global warming, they can tell you the things they do to slow down global warming, or tell you the 10 things they do right to justify the one thing that isn't so right. They might say they drive an electric car, donate to Greenpeace, and only buy organic produce while they drink a Frappuccino from Starbucks with a plastic straw because they don't like the way the paper ones feel. I'm so fascinated with Milwaukee segregation because I don't think a case can be made that draws any other conclusion other than we're all at fault. All 1.5 million of us. Unless you are part of some select group of people that didn't choose where to live, you are part of the group of people that made a choice on where to call home. All 1.5 million of us, old enough to live on our own, made a choice on where to live, and the collective choices of the 1.5 million of us made a segregated city. Some of us make that choice based on convenience or personal level of access. Some of us make that choice based on what we think living in an area will do for us, and some of us make that choice without thinking much about it. But we all make that choice. That's why I can't draw any other conclusion other than we are all responsible at roughly the same level. Strangely, it's why I think little has changed since the 2010 census, where the dissimilarity index was slightly higher. We are simultaneously all responsible, but not enough to warrant meaningful action. It reminds me of something that happens to me every couple of months, especially when we're driving across the country to or from a fish show. We hit traffic, but not in an area that should have traffic. We might be on a smaller 2-lane highway or miles outside of a city when everyone in the right lane slows, almost to a stop as they approach a traffic cone or a mattress in the lane. Each car has to brake enough to safely make their way around the thing in the road. Maybe I understand collective responsibility, or maybe I like getting out of the truck in the middle of the highway and chucking stuff, but when we come across that situation, I get out and do something about it. Well, don't tell the Michigan Department of Transportation, but it was me that threw the traffic barrel down the ravine 30 miles north of the Indiana border. Hundreds of cars slowed almost to a stop, which means hundreds of drivers, many with the capacity to hurl a barrel, could have, but chose not to. That's the problem with collective responsibility. Each of us has so little of it that we easily ignore or neglect that responsibility. In our house, I'm the one responsible for paying the energy bill. I physically go online and pay the bill. If I don't pay the bill doesn't get paid. I can never blame anyone other than myself if the bill hasn't been paid. If I died tomorrow, someone else would have to be responsible for paying it. I like the mattress in the highway analogy because once someone passes the mattress, they no longer have to deal with the consequences of there being something in the middle of the road. The traveler 5 miles behind them will have to deal with the consequences, and if someone does stop and move it out of the way, they would likely never know that there was someone's mattress or couch cushion causing a problem 5 minutes earlier. I go on Reddit sometimes. I mostly look at the Fish page where people talk about things semi-related to the band Fish. If I look at anything else, it'll be the Milwaukee page. I'd say every third time I look, someone asks about which neighborhoods are good and which ones they should avoid. I'm moving to Milwaukee from Seattle. Where should I live? Might be the title of the post. I don't know if I would have cared about Milwaukee's segregation issue if I didn't live in one of those neighborhoods the Redditors reliably tell people to avoid. At least I wouldn't have cared more than having the someone should do something about that feeling. The someone should do something about that feeling is a personal sense of responsibility on a larger collective issue. Because I'm a tiny fraction of a percent responsible, I should create some action to ensure I'm doing my part. It's why I don't dump used motor oil down the sewer drain in the alley. In my lifetime, I won't do enough oil changes in my garage to acquire enough oil to dump into the water system to make a significant impact on the environment. But I know that if we all dumped our oil down the drain, we would run into a problem. Sometimes the small things we don't do add up just as much as the small things we are doing. The issue of segregation makes me ask the question, why does it stay the way it is? In order for our city and others dealing with a segregation problem to change, people have to move. I don't like moving. Moving's the worst. By the definition of the dissimilarity index, a percentage of people in the minority would have to move, or a percentage of people in the majority would need to relocate to areas that are majority minority. Milwaukee's segregation issue is so interesting to me because enough people could decide to move tomorrow to make headway on the problem, but that would require a tremendous amount of effort from a relatively small number of people. It's also unrealistic and most likely would create all sorts of unintended consequences. The issue of desegregation makes me wonder what the process looks like long term. I can envision what it would look like if the process took 12 months, but what if it took 12 years or 12 decades? What form would the process take, and what would we see as signs that progress is being made? For a long time, I worked in a school district that shares a border with the city of Milwaukee. The two cities that make up the attendance region for the district were, at one point, very white cities. That changed during my employment there, and the district became majority-minority. There, I met people that encouraged their city's recent integration, and I met people who discouraged it. I worked as an assistant principal for a year at that district's largest high school. Part of being an assistant principal is supervising sporting events like varsity basketball games. The first time I was scheduled to supervise a basketball game, I got there early and sat in the stands during the JV game. As students started to trickle in, I said hi and made small talk. The JV game wrapped up and the gym filled with students and parents. Midway through the first quarter, I left my seat and stood at the opposite side of the court, in the visitors section, facing our student section. Living where I do, I think I am hypersensitive to anything that can be construed as a race issue. But I don't know how anyone sitting in the visitors section wouldn't notice what I saw. Our student section was segregated. There was a white cheering section with one black student in it, and to the right of that was the black student section with one white student in it. Dex has been in Little League now for 5 or 6 years. The fields used by the Beckham-Stapleton Little League are pretty nice, and there are 3 of them in a row. Sometimes, maybe twice or 3 times a year, a team from a neighboring suburb will come out and play my son Dex's team. Beckham-Stapleton is a black Little League. Dex and another kid he has known since he was 3 are usually the only white boys on his team, or really in his age division. Typically, white kids have white parents and black kids have black parents. The surrounding suburbs are overwhelmingly white, so when Dex's team plays a team from outside the league, white parents come to watch their white children play baseball. At each of the fields, there are at least 3 sets of stands. Each time another team has come to Beckham, the stands are segregated. Sure, they're segregated because families from the same team like to sit together, but they're still segregated. There are black stands and white stands. Again, if I didn't live in an all-black neighborhood, I probably wouldn't have even thought to think about segregation. In my lifetime, I have been the only white person in situations too numerous to count. Literally, every day I go home, I'm one of the few in my neighborhood. Every neighborhood meeting I go to, every time I walk down the street, I stand out. And I think it's okay to stand out. In fact, standing out, I think, moves the needle a tiny fraction. I think it's the responsibility of the majority group to desegregate, because the majority group has the power. If you are part of a majority group, it's okay to be the minority in a situation. Desegregation takes action. It doesn't just happen by accident. At one point, it took policies to undo policies put in place to keep us separated. But today in the story of racial reconciliation, it takes small action over and over again. The stands at baseball or the stands at the high school basketball game could have been desegregated by a relatively small percentage of the fans, but they weren't, because it requires action. It's easier to be the person who bitches about the traffic barrel in the middle of the highway as you change lanes to avoid it after sitting in traffic for 20 minutes. It's harder to be the type of person that parks their car and chucks it into a ravine. Inaction is always easier than action, but inaction and change are not compatible. We do not arrive at anything different if we do not do something different.